Imagine you owe someone $10,000. Instead of handing over cash, you hand them a check. Has the debt been paid, or is it merely waiting? The answer depends entirely on what kind of instrument was delivered, and that distinction can completely change everyone's legal rights. Some negotiable instruments are treated almost like cash: a certified check, a cashier's check, or a teller's check. Unless the parties agree otherwise, accepting one of these generally discharges the underlying obligation. But there's an important detail. Even though the original debt has been discharged, that does not erase every obligation connected to the instrument. If the person who issued the instrument later becomes liable as an endorser, that endorsement liability can still remain. Discharging the debt does not automatically eliminate endorsement responsibilities. Now the rules change. Most everyday checks are uncertified checks, and many commercial obligations involve promissory notes. When these instruments are accepted, the debt usually is not immediately discharged. Instead, the obligation is suspended. Think of suspension as pressing the pause button. The debt isn't gone. It's simply waiting to see what happens next. Suppose the uncertified check reaches the bank, and payment is honored. At that moment, the suspended obligation becomes discharged to the extent the check has been paid. But what if the bank refuses payment? The check has been dishonored. Now the suspension ends, without satisfying the debt. If the creditor is still the person entitled to enforce the instrument, the law generally allows enforcement of either the check itself or the original obligation. Promissory notes operate much the same way. Accepting the note suspends the debt. If the note is eventually paid, the obligation is discharged to that extent. But if the note is dishonored, the suspension ends and enforcement rights return. Sometimes, the instrument wasn't issued by the debtor at all. Instead, the debtor transfers someone else's negotiable instrument to satisfy the obligation. If that third-party instrument later discharges the debtor's liability on the instrument, the underlying obligation is discharged as well. Possession changes everything. If someone else becomes the person entitled to enforce the instrument, the original creditor generally cannot enforce the suspended obligation, because only the person legally entitled to enforce the instrument controls those rights. Not every negotiable instrument fits neatly into these categories. For other instruments, the law asks one important question: is a bank liable as maker or acceptor? If so, the instrument is generally treated like the bank-backed instruments we discussed earlier. If not, the ordinary suspension rules usually apply. Receiving a negotiable instrument does not always mean the debt has been paid. Sometimes the obligation is immediately discharged. Sometimes it is merely suspended. And sometimes the right to enforce depends entirely upon who possesses the instrument and what ultimately happens to it. Understanding that distinction explains why commercial law treats negotiable instruments not simply as pieces of paper, but as legally powerful promises that temporarily or permanently change the obligations between parties.